guys. I have to tell you how excited I am to share today's guest with you. And a huge part of the reason why I'm so excited to share today's guest is that I am bringing you my sister, Sarah Archer. She is incredible. And why I wanted to bring her on, aside from the fact that I just thought it would be really cool to have her on the show, is she has done what a lot of you I know want to do, which is write a book. And not only did she write a book, but she got picked up by a major publisher for her first book and got a 6-figure advance. And the only reason why I share that is that I think there are so many of you who are looking to figure out, how do you write a book? How do you get signed by a major publisher? And how can you make good money off of it as well? And I was so impressed by her through this whole process and what she did. And she's super humble as well. So I wasn't sure if she was going to be willing to even talk about any of this, but she was, in the hopes that it would be of service to some of you who are really looking to make great money as an author. And I will say she's a fiction author, so it's going to be a little bit of a different process than those of you who are looking to write more business, entrepreneur, personal development books. But regardless of what genre or industry you're in, you can take away so much of what Sarah teaches in today's episode about what the process was like for her. So she's going to share really how the whole journey happened for her of writing her first book, what you should be thinking about if you were looking to write your first book. She's going to share exactly how she got her agent, which helped her negotiate the advance, and also just how to kind of navigate the ups and downs, the emotional ups and downs that happen along the journey of writing your book. Because I think from the outside, hers looks a lot like a Cinderella story, but she's very real, that there were challenges and rejection along the way. And for any of us who are looking to put our art out into the world, our work out into the world, whether that's a podcast, whether that's your book, whether it's, a YouTube video series, whether you want to get more visible on video, whatever it is, I know how those feelings of fear of criticism and judgment can pop up. And Sarah shares how she deals with it, how she handles it. And I think there's so many good takeaways here for anyone who's building a personal brand. But this one is especially for all of my writer listeners, my author listeners. I really think you're going to be inspired by her journey. I know I am. I managed to make it through with only crying once in this interview, so I'm proud of myself for that. But I just can't wait for you to get to meet my sister and learn from her. So super excited, guys. Get ready to enjoy this conversation and this interview with my sister, Sarah Archer. Okay, well, this is probably the interview. I mean, much respect to all of my previous guests. However, out of all my interviews so far, this is probably the one that I am most excited about because, guys, I get to introduce you to my sister, which is so exciting.
Hello.
So, my sister, Sarah, is, she's incredible. And like I mentioned to you in the intro, she just had her first book published and did such an incredible job. And yes, I'm biased, but literally I was reading it on a flight and I was crying, like tears streaming down my face, because it was, not only was it that you had written it, but it was so good. It was so good.
Thank
and
you.
I know absolutely. It's like for a lot of people listening, either they have written a book and are really looking to expand their, their writing and publishing career, or they're aspiring authors. And so I just thought, I've been looking for a reason to interview you on the podcast. It'll be a miracle if we make it through without like having to do 20 edits because we're laughing.
Crazy.
Yeah, it's already been like a weird start just because it's going to happen when you meet your sister.
We'll try to act normal.
But yeah, like I just wanted you to kind of share with people about your journey of writing this book and what you learned along the way. And I mean, we'll talk about the fact that you managed to get a major advance with it as well, which is super rare in the world of writing. But the reason I want to talk about that is there's a lot of people who they want to figure out how to make money writing books, and that feels very challenging as well.
It is challenging.
Yeah. So
Sure.
we'll talk about all the things. So, okay. So your book, The Plus One, you just had like a super successful launch. I want to know from your perspective, what the journey was like to get from the point where you knew you wanted to write a book to it actually coming to fruition. So what was the point at which you knew that you wanted to be a published author?
Really probably around the time I was 7 years old. So in that sense, it's been a very long journey from that time. The Plus One was my first novel that I wrote, but I've written a lot of other things in the past, screenplays, short stories, poems. I studied creative writing in school. So it's been really kind of a lifelong journey. But for the actual timeline of this book itself, The Plus One, I wrote it, I think it was about 2 years start to finish that I spent writing it. And I was working on other things intermittently over that time too. So it wasn't just that. But it took me about 2 years total to write it. And then from there, I started querying agents. And within maybe a few months, I got an agent. And then once I had her, I started a round of revisions based on her notes, which took a few months. Then she sent the book out on submission to different editors. That process, I think, was maybe a few weeks to a month total. Then once I started working with an editor, there was another round of revisions based on her notes, which took another few months. And then from that point, when the final completed manuscript was turned in and accepted, it was about a year to publication. So all told, from the time that I had the idea for this book and started on it to when it came out was about 4 years total. And I mean, it can vary so much though for different people. I know like the publishing process obviously is going to vary depending on what sorts of revisions you're doing, who the publisher is, how much time they need to launch it for marketing and publicity. Also, they'll take into account different logistical factors about like, are there current events that they have to take into account when they figure out when it would be the best time to launch, other books coming out. I know, for instance, for me, my editor wanted to position it as sort of like a summer beach read type of book. So we shot for a July release date. So all of those things can play into the decision about how long it's going to take between when the book is ready and when it actually appears on shelves. And then the writing process too. I mean, for different writers, it's very variable. I've talked to writers who take only a few months to write a book. You know, those are usually people who maybe are working like in a mystery series where it's the same characters every time and they're just doing a different story. But I've also talked to a lot of authors who take 10 years to write a book, and that's not uncommon. So it's really different for everyone.
Yeah. Well, and I think one of the things I want to drive home is like, you knew you were going to do this from age 7,
Yeah.
which is not, which is not surprising.
It wasn't a whim.
Yeah. It's like, this is one of our parents' favorite stories to tell and talk about is, do you remember our Christmas plays that we used to do?
Vividly.
So when we were growing up, Sarah was, and frankly, I wasn't surprised either that you wrote this. It was like very much knew it was going to happen, in your blood, which is awesome. But yeah, you used to put on Christmas plays for the family. And I think you would write like this full, very in-depth script. And it was so good.
We would act them out with our American Girl dolls.
Yeah, we would act them out with American Girl dolls. And I remember I was like, I never wanted to come to rehearsal. I was always so annoyed to have to like be, contained in a room.
I just wanted to wing it.
I just wanted to wing it.
On opening night.
And it's hilarious. I was thinking about this before the interview today. I was like, there were so many indicators to how we were going to be as adults when we were kids. But you would write the most amazing screenplays and scripts. I mean, from the age of 7, it's like, it was crazy what you did. So I think it's important just to kind of look at, some people may look at this from the outside and say, gosh, her first book, like she got, signed with a major publisher and all of this stuff. And yes, you did. And there's also been a long journey behind it as well. Yeah. So I want to hear from your perspective, for a lot of our listeners, it's like, they have aspirations of writing a book, but they feel like they don't even know where to start. And I would love to hear from your perspective, just any advice you would give to an aspiring first-time author. And I think the other thing that we should probably point out here is your book is fiction. So there's going to be a different process for a fiction writer versus a nonfiction writer, but I think there's also going to be some overlap. So, kind of for someone who has a vision of writing their book, and getting published, I think specifically with a traditional publisher, what words of wisdom would you give to somebody?
Well, I would say, first of all, like, start slow. You don't have to really jump in at the deep end. I think the idea of writing a whole book can be very intimidating. And I mean, I've written at this point 2 books because I have my first book, the plus one, which already came out, but I also am working on a second book, which is still in development, but I've written a few drafts. So I've written the book. And I still feel like I don't know how to write a book. Like if I think about starting on number 3 and, you know, starting from scratch with a new story, I'm like, how do I do that? It feels overwhelming when you think of it as a whole. But just start small and take it one step at a time. I know for me, like I'll get ideas and I just jot them down as notes. I have like a long running document where I keep track of different ideas that I have that are just totally random. It might be like an idea for a whole story. It might be just a word that I like or a line or something. And I just kind of keep track of things as they come to me. And if I have an idea that I'm sort of getting more ideas about that idea as time goes on, like I have the initial concept for a story and then I keep thinking about like, oh, well, maybe this character would be good, or here's a detail that I want to put in. That is kind of a good indicator to me over time that like there's something there to work with because my brain keeps kind of coming back to it. And so I'll spend maybe a few months doing that where I'm more actively working on other projects. But in the meantime, I've always got ideas that I'm sort of thinking about in the back of my head and making notes on. And then that means that by the time I actually sit down to really actively start working on something, I've already got some notes built up that I can work from, which I think is really important because just staring at like a blank page and telling yourself you have to start from scratch and write something is really hard. So even if my notes are just kind of random jumble and they don't make much sense, like at least it's something that I can read through to kind of get the ideas going. And in the whole writing process, it's really the same sort of thing where just don't put too much pressure on yourself. You have to understand that it is a process and it's not going to be perfect the first time around. Pretty much all writers are going to go through multiple drafts. I know for me, from the first draft to the final draft, something I'm writing can change a lot. So sometimes you're writing and you come to a point where you get stuck on something and you don't really know, like, oh, I can't figure out the right word to use here, the right way to phrase this line, or the scene feels like it's not working right and I don't know why, or even a whole storyline maybe is not coming together, and you can't figure out what's wrong, or maybe you do know but you can't figure out how to fix it. And you can sit with it and try to work on it a little bit, but there comes a time when you have to just move on and just say, like, it's not perfect right now, but I'm just going to go on to the next thing so that you don't get stuck. I think it's really important to just keep writing and keep the ideas coming. And then know that you can come back to it and you're going to make changes later. And, you know, sometimes something has to start out being sort of mediocre before you can turn it into a good version, before that can then become the excellent version. It's not going to be excellent the first time around. So just have patience with the process.
I want to get your perspective too, because I know some authors I hear it's like they have a goal of I'm going to write X number of words per day. So for you, do you have anything like I'm curious, how many words do you write a day? How much time do you spend writing a day? Do you have goals, or is it more it just kind of happens as it happens? But I really do want to know, how much time every day is this taking you to do this as you know, as a full-time gig?
I don't set goals for myself, which maybe I should. I
seem to be doing okay without it.
Well, I think maybe I'd be better if I were more disciplined about it. And there are some people who set hard goals for themselves. For me, I don't really track how many words per day I'm doing because I find that so much of the writing process is not writing. It's coming up with ideas, it's brainstorming, it's making outlines, it's fleshing out characters. It's reading what you've written and going through and figuring out how to make changes and what's not working, and breaking out timelines, doing research. There's so much else that goes into it that most of the hours I spend writing are not actually writing and generating words. So there are days when I'm focusing on that, and I can focus on turning out as many pages as possible. But I try not to make that the rule, because then there are days when you're not able to generate a lot of words, but it's because you realized something isn't working here and you get an idea for, oh, I have to go back and change this other thing. And that's still part of the process and it's still important. So I don't want to get too caught up on like, oh, I'm not making my word count for the day, so it doesn't count. And then also, I mean, outside of the writing, being an author involves a lot of other time spent on social media, you know, doing interviews and things like this. I spend a lot of time reading for other writers and giving them notes, which I think hopefully helps them, but also helps me as a writer just to constantly be kind of flexing those muscles. So there's a lot of hours that I spend too that are not working on my own work actively, but are still part of the process and part of the career.
Yeah, well, and I want to ask you about something you said, which I hadn't thought about it like that, but it's
Mhm.
so true that most of your time writing is not actually spent
Yeah.
writing. How do you come up with new ideas? Like, do you have a certain process where you know when you need to kind of get in the zone and let the creative ideas flow?
Mhm.
Do you go for a walk? Do you take a bubble bath? Like, is there something that's kind of your go-to where you're able to create the space for creativity and new ideas to flow in? Do you have any like rituals or anything you do that helps kind of prompt creativity for you?
I don't have anything I do to try intentionally to get new ideas. I find a lot of times for me, the times when ideas are most likely to come are when my brain is sort of freed up to think about other things. Like for instance, for the plus one, when I had the idea for that, I was living in LA at the time. So I spent a lot of time sitting in traffic, obviously. And it was one of those moments where I was just sitting there, not moving. And so my mind was kind of wandering and the idea came to me. So sitting in traffic, taking a shower. Sometimes it's like when you're lying down to sleep at night and you're trying to fall asleep and you don't have anything to write with, but that's when the ideas start coming. So
Mhm.
for me, it's in those moments and I don't really try to force it. I just kind of let it happen. But when I'm more actively working on something and like sitting down with it and trying to figure it out, there are sometimes like writing prompts you can do, and you can find a ton of those online to help you figure out different characters and just exercises like, for instance, take a scene that you're writing, but write it from the perspective of a different character, something like that. There's a ton of things you can do like that just to kind of give you more ideas. I also find for me during the writing process, the two things that are the biggest help when I'm revising specifically are either taking some time away from it, because then when I come back to the project, I have fresh eyes and I'll always see things that I didn't see before. And then also getting other people's feedback. So just having other people read and then give me their perspectives helps me to see what I couldn't really see on my own.
Okay, that's super helpful. One of the things I wanted to ask you about, because,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, look, like we kind of talked about at the beginning, people think it would be so exciting to publish a book and to get paid to do it. And I also know that that can be challenging. And
Mm-hmm.
I want to help people make all of the money. So, what I
Yes.
want to hear from you is, I mean, let's just call it like it is. You got a honk in advance. You got a six-figure advance for your first book, which is like so impressive to me. And I just want to, I know you can't tell people 100% how to do that, but
Yeah.
I really want to hear from your perspective what that journey was like, anything that you can share with people that would help them if they are looking to figure out
Mm-hmm.
how to get in advance, especially as a first time author. Just kind of share with them what you did to help make that happen, and how
Sure.
people can do the same thing.
Um, well, I think just to get a good advance and to get published, honestly, a lot of it comes down to luck, which is not very helpful, but I think it's true. I also think for the advance, I mean, my editor and my agent worked that out between the two of them, so that I'll give them the credit for that. But for what I did as part of the process, just to get published, I really did it the old-fashioned way. I wrote a manuscript. I sent out cold query letters to agents I didn't know, and I got an agent, and then she got me the book deal.
So, okay, I want to pause you. I want to pause you right there. When you were
Mhm.
sending these letters out, what did they say? Like, kind of talk us through when you were doing this outreach. What was
Mhm.
included in the letters? What was the process like? Like, let's get into some of the details there.
Yeah, so I can talk about what I did as a fiction writer. Obviously, for nonfiction, it's a little bit different.
Mhm.
And I think for nonfiction, so for fiction, you have to have a completed manuscript before you start going out. For nonfiction, I think you can actually start with a proposal and maybe a few sample chapters.
Yep,
So it's
that's
a little
true.
bit different. And then also for nonfiction, just it's important to bear in mind that I think who you are as the author plays a bigger role and what your platform is, what sort of expertise you can demonstrate on the subject, that sort of thing. So that might affect the process if that's the route that you're going down. For me, though, as a novelist, with the query letters that I sent, I think a good guiding principle is to think quality over quantity. Like I've heard some people will just sort of carpet bomb the industry and they'll send out just tons and tons of letters because they figure like, oh, it's a numbers game. Like if I send enough query letters, somebody's going to want the book. And I don't think that's necessarily the best use of your time as a writer, or frankly, it's not really a good use of the agent's time if you're sending them material that's not a good fit for them, and that you could have, if you just took a few minutes to do a little bit of research, you would have seen it's not something that they would be interested in. And these are obviously very busy people, so you want to be respectful of their time. So I would say just make sure that you're not sending letters just for the sake of sending them, but that you're really targeting them. There's so much information you can find online about different agents. For me, I kind of started backwards a little bit. Like I would look at books that I thought were targeting the same sort of audience that might go for my book, and figure out, who represented those authors, which you can usually find out through Google. And then research those agents and try to find out which of them might be a good fit for me. And most agents will have a bio or something on their company website that might talk about what they're interested in. A lot of them have a social media presence. A lot of them have done interviews over the years that you can find online. There's also something called manuscript wishlist, which there's a website, manuscriptwishlist.com, and then there's also a hashtag on Twitter, which I think is hashtag MSWL for manuscript wishlist, which agents will use to post things that they're interested in, like stuff that they haven't really seen much of coming through, but that they'd like to see. So they might post like, hashtag MSWL, I'd love to get a YA fantasy with neurodiversity or something like that. So that's a good thing.
A YA fantasy with diversity?
Neurodiversity.
Oh.
Or neurodiversity. That's also
it's weird out there. Okay.
Yes. Yeah. So, but it's a good way. Like if you're looking to find agents who might be interested in what you've written, you can find someone who is already looking for something similar to your book. So just do as much research as you can, and then I would also recommend just putting that information into the query letter. Like if you have a reason that you're reaching out to an agent, tell them like, I'm a fan of your client so-and-so, and so I'd love to introduce you to my book, which is also a Southern Gothic novel or something like that. Let them know why they should pay attention to your letter, that you have done your research and that you're reaching out to them individually for a reason. You're not just sort of copying and pasting the same letter to everyone. So yeah, I think tailoring your letters is very helpful.
So level of intentionality. And what are these letters called? Career letters?
Query.
Query letters.
Yeah.
Okay. Got it. Okay. Yeah. I'm with you. So query letters. So, okay. That makes sense, which is.
And there's a lot of information too online about like the format for them and the length and that sort of thing too.
How many did you send out before you landed your agent?
I'm trying to remember. I was doing it sort of on a rolling basis, where as I would research and come across someone who I thought would be a good fit, I would query that person. So I had done maybe 20, 30 letters at that point. And there were some that I had not heard back from at the point when I signed with my current agent. So, because some people will get back to you in a day, some people will take months and months and months. Some people, if they're not interested, they just don't respond at all. So you have to, that's another thing, is like, just keep track of what you're sending out and to whom, so that you are not, doubling up on the same people or anything like that. But I had sent, I would say maybe 20 to 30 letters. And like I said, some of them I haven't even heard back from yet. So yeah.
Well, they are now kicking themselves that they have not gotten back to you.
I'm sure they'll be fine.
But I think that's, I think that's such an important point that you just made, is like the level of customization and the level of intentionality that you use with your work, which I think someone can apply to any type of partnership they're trying to build or any sort of platform they're trying to get on, whether someone is looking to get featured in major media, they're trying to get on someone's podcast, or they're trying to land an agent. When you let someone know that you actually have done the research, care about who they are personally interested in working with them, your chances of making a connection with them are going to go way up. So does it take more time? Yes. But is it worth it? Yes. I mean, I'm actually, this would be an interesting question. For each query letter you did, how much time went into each one in terms of research, like putting it together? Just give us an estimate, like a ballpark estimate.
maybe an hour or so. I mean, it's hard to say exactly, but I started out with like a template query letter that I wrote, but then I would customize it for each person. So I already had like a basis to go off of, and then I would just make changes to it as I went. Also, every agent will have different specifications for how you're supposed to query. Some of them might want, and again, this is more talking about the fiction perspective, but some might want like a 5-page synopsis. Some might want the first 10 pages of the book. Like they're all going to be different. So you also have to take the time just to put together each submission one by one. So that takes time too. But yeah, I would say maybe an hour for each person or so. But I think it's worth it to do that as opposed to just, you know, sending out a ton of letters where you know that most of them are not going to bear any fruit.
It's making me laugh because it's bringing me back to my online dating days where I remember getting notes from guys where I was like, I
they're
know
just
you
sending
just
it to the same person.
yeah, there was one point at which both my girlfriend and I were on the same site and we both got the exact same note from the same guy on the same day.
Yeah.
Come on, dude.
And of course, you know, you don't want to date that person. It's the same way. If somebody receives a query letter that says just "Dear Agent" at the top, it's going to immediately get thrown out. So
yeah, I've just reduced your entire process to online dating.
It's pretty similar, probably.
So, okay, so you sent out the letters to the agents, and then I'm assuming it's kind of just, is it like a courting? The analogy keeps going. Is it like, what's the process like from there where you're starting to get to hear back? What was the time from which your agent first connected with you to the time at which they were signed? Like, kind of walk us through that process.
From that point, it was pretty quick, I think. So different agents will approach it differently, but typically when you send out the query, you're not sending them the entire manuscript up front. You're sending a letter and then, like I was saying, maybe a synopsis or a few pages or something. So then if they're interested in seeing more, they might ask you. Some will ask for an entire manuscript at that point. Some will ask for like 50 pages. And then if they like that, then they'll ask for the whole manuscript. And obviously different people take different lengths of time to read and get back to you too. With my agent, I think that she asked for the whole manuscript up front, and then maybe it was like a few weeks or a month or so before I heard back that she wanted to represent me. And then from that point, it was pretty quick. Like it was basically just decided on the basis of the manuscript. I didn't have to do an interview or anything like that. So yeah, and then there's also like once I got the offer from her, I took maybe a week or two just to let the people who I had outstanding queries to, just to let them know, just sort of as a courtesy, because it's just kind of general practice. If there's anyone who still has a query but hasn't gotten back to you, you just shoot them a note to let them know, like, I have an offer from someone else. If you're interested, please let me know by this date, just so that you officially give them a chance to jump in if they're interested.
Or you're off the market. Yeah, that's so. I mean, it sounds like. Is there anything else that you would say in terms of how someone can help increase the amount of their advance? I know you said it really came down to your agent and publisher negotiating, but anything? I mean, obviously, writing a quality book, right? Like, I think that's probably the most obvious. But anything?
Yeah, that's say. Well, I mean, I think writing a quality book, it's the hard part, but it's where it all comes from. Yeah, I mean, there's no kind of easy way around it, unfortunately.
Well, I mean, I think, and that's really what I want to drive home for people here too, is like creating really incredible work and knowing that at some point you will be paid well for that work. And I look back to, you know, your career and having known you from birth and seeing what you've done. It's like, you've been training your whole life for this. You know, you've been really, really working to get to this point. And I wanted to ask you just a couple more questions here. One is, I would love to hear just about any sort of challenges that you overcame along the process of writing this book. I think from an outside perspective, like we talked about before, it can, you know, it's easy to look at what you've done and say, gosh, like she snapped her fingers. There was a book. She had a great advance. She's writing her second book now. And so it can kind of be like that first time author Cinderella story. And I don't want to discredit the elements of that are so true. And I also know that just like any other big accomplishment, there's ups and downs and there's challenges. So anything you can share about maybe like a challenge you overcame through the process, or a time at which you didn't think it was going to come together and you made it happen, like kind of walk us through some of the challenges you went through along the way.
Yeah. I mean, I think I never thought it was going to come together, but that's probably just the way I think. But for me, I mean, rejection is such a part of the writing process for everyone. I mean, when I was sending out queries to agents, I got some rejections. When my agent was sending the book out to editors, I'm sure there were some people who said no. I wasn't involved in that process personally, so I didn't hear it, but I'm sure that that's always the case. When the book came out, you know, there were good reviews and there were bad reviews, and nothing is going to be for everyone. Writing is very subjective, so you're always going to have people who don't like what you write or it's just not for them. Um, and I mean, it's part of the process. There's a writer named Tim Wagoner who wrote a blog post earlier this year about kind of his experiences with rejection as a writer over the course of his career, and the post went viral. It's interesting to look at on his website if you get a chance, because I think a lot of people connected to it just because they're like, oh, so you're this successful working writer making a living, and you've also gone through all these challenges, so it's not just me. So
Yeah.
I think you just have to know that it's part of the process, and criticism is going to come, rejection is going to come.
Tell us about, if I can pause you for just a second,
Mhm.
because I think something you said is so important. How do you deal with the negative reviews? Do you read them? Do you not read them? How do you deal with it when you like,
Mhm.
because that's something a lot of people today are struggling with, whether they're a writer or not. They, you know, they're scared to be visible because they don't want to have haters. They don't want to have
Yeah.
criticism. I hear it like every single day. How do you deal with it?
Personally, I deal with it by mostly ignoring it. You know, I've read some reviews, but I don't Google myself. I don't go on, you know, Amazon and read the reviews, which, you know, maybe there's a benefit in doing that just to keep better track of it. But for me, I would rather just kind of keep focused on the writing and keep looking ahead to my current projects that I'm working on. I think reviews can definitely get in your head and can sort of mess with you and make you question your own judgment. And sometimes, like if there's certain common feedback that you're getting from multiple people, maybe that's something that's actually useful that you can take advantage of. But so much of the time, that's not the case. And
Mhm.
I'll look at reviews for other things that I've read, or you know, books that I've loved, or movies that I've loved, and I read other people's reviews on them. And half the time, I don't agree with what that person thought or what their reaction was, and there might be something that I loved and thought like, wow, this book was so amazing, and I go look at the reviews and they're not very good.
Yeah.
So it's so subjective, it's so personal. So I think it's healthy to bear that in mind and just know that, you know, the good reviews are nice, but they don't define you, and the bad reviews also don't define you. And just for me personally, I try not to pay much attention to it.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that you share that, and this is something that it's helped me just deal with any sort of fear of criticism. Is it's
Mm-hmm.
just this reminder that I have yet to be criticized by someone more successful than me.
Mm-hmm.
And when I think about, you know, the people are taking the time to write something that, you know, there's an element of, if you know someone personally and you want to offer them constructive criticism, they've
Mm-hmm.
asked for it. It's like,
Yeah.
that's different. But the people who are sitting around writing the hateful stuff, they're nowhere near the level of success that you're at, and they're just
Mm-hmm.
mad about it. You know, it's like, the only people who are going to put the energy into that are the people who see something in you that they want for themselves, and they're
Mm-hmm.
mad that they haven't done it, and so they're going to take it out on you. And so
Yeah.
I just like, oh, I didn't think I was going to cry. I'm so
It's getting personal.
I'm so proud of you for what you've done.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it
I
takes.
think,
Go ahead. You
oh,
talk, because I'm going to cry.
I'll let you cry for a minute. No, I mean, I think it's true. Like it's hard to write a book, and it's a lot easier to read it and have an opinion about it. And not to say like, if someone leaves a bad review, I don't discount that. They're totally entitled to that opinion. And I've read things that I didn't like, but I know for me as a reader, I always like anything that I read, even if I by and large don't like it or have a lot of criticism about it, I can always find things that I admire that I like. And so I always try to you know, acknowledge that, and just acknowledge that it's hard to make something creative, whether it's a book or a movie or any sort of endeavor. You know, people are putting a lot of themselves into it, and it takes a lot of work, and it can be harder than it looks like. So just I respect that in other people too.
That's so diplomatic. I think you should just write these people into your next book and kill them, give them a
Oh,
terrible death.
I guess I could try that too.
I mean, you have a very satisfying outlet to deal with.
Yes. Send them an advanced reader copy. I can hear your thoughts. Turn to page 19.
Where you die a slow and brutal death.
Yes.
Oh man, this is awesome. I'm so excited. I'm so proud of you. I'm so excited for what you've done. And I think people will love your book. They'll love your blog. So one of the things that I always love is like your writing is hilarious. Like you have all these different styles and like kind of angles from which you write, but you're one of the funniest writers I've ever read. And it's like literally I'll sit there with Jason, my husband, and I'll read him your blog and we're both like rolling on the floor laughing, just like your perspective, your commentaries on things. So I want to ask you one final question, but before we do, I just want you to share with people, where can they go to get your book, The Plus One? How can they find you online? Like kind of tell people all the places they can find you to connect with you.
Yeah, so probably the easiest place is my website, which is saraharcherwrites.com, writes as in WRITES. And from there are links to different booksellers. You can find the book, at local booksellers, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, wherever you prefer. There's also links to my social media handles on there, my blog, like you were mentioning. So that's a good place to go for updates. And you can also sign up for my newsletter through the website too, which I don't send out too often. I don't want to overload people, but when I have something to share, I send out a newsletter.
And on her Instagram, you can go find all pictures of her pug Lewis.
Yes.
Who is like the mascot. Oh.
Who is currently snoring, so you might hear him every now and then.
So this is so amazing, and I want to say thank you for sharing everything.
Thank
I know.
Thank you for having me.
Oh my gosh, yeah, it's like so much of your work is done like behind the screen and right, but there's so much wisdom to your journey that you can share with other people who want to do the same thing. So thank you. And I'll kind of open up just as we close with the final question, just of any other words of advice or wisdom for authors or aspiring authors who want to really make a greater impact in the world with their work.
I would say just write what you're passionate about. Tell a story that you really want to tell. It's easy to get caught up in the sort of marketing angle of it and like, oh, what are the trends that are going on right now? What are people looking for? What's popular? And that stuff is important, but I think it should be secondary, and you should always lead with the content and lead with telling something that you're really passionate about telling. I know like when I was writing The Plus One, I just had an idea and I wrote it the way I wanted to write it. And I really was not thinking at all at the time about genre or audience or anything like that. Then when I started the querying process, that was when I was like, okay, I have to figure out how to pitch this in a way that is appealing and zeitgeisty and all of that. And I was able to think about like, okay, well, it's a story about women working in STEM. It has to do with AI. It's kind of the somewhat feminist take on a romantic comedy. Those sorts of things that you can talk about to help pitch the story. But those weren't the reasons why I was writing it. At its heart, it's basically just a classic story about a person looking for love. And that's what I was focusing on when I was creating the story. I think there's an example I can give that's a helpful illustration of that. There's a company in LA called The Blacklist, which started out as a literal list of just the best liked screenplays that came out every year that were sort of circulating around the industry. And it's now grown into a whole company that's pretty well regarded in the industry. And one of the things they do is they run workshops for writers. So a couple of years ago, I was invited to participate in one of those. And they had these two screenwriters that they brought in for the weekend to be our mentors. And these were both successful working screenwriters. They work for companies like Pixar and major players like that. And they were talking about their journeys in their careers. It was interesting to me because they both had very sort of similar career arcs up until that point. Like they had started out by writing a spec script, so something that you just are writing on your own. You're not getting paid for it. Nobody is asking you to write this idea or develop this property. It's just a story that you want to tell. And both of them were able to sell those scripts in pretty big deals, and they got a lot of attention for it, and it launched their careers. And so then they spent maybe the next 5 to 10 years or so working in Hollywood. They were working consistently, it was going well, but it was mostly work that was on assignment. Other people were coming to them and saying, here's this idea that I want you to write, or here's a piece of IP that I want you to develop, something like that. And they both felt over time that it was just kind of like going to a slump, like the passion was dwindling because they were writing other people's stories and not their own.
Mm.
And they both came to a point where they decided, I'm just going to write another spec script. Like, I'm not getting paid for it. It's a risk. Who knows if anybody will want to do anything with it. But I'm just going to take the time and do it and just write something that I really want to write for myself. And for both of them, they sold those scripts in big competitive deals. They made a lot of money off of it. They got a lot of attention off of it, and it really invigorated their careers. And that's not always how it happens. Obviously, if you're writing something on spec, statistically, most of them don't go anywhere, so it is a risk. But I think it's a good example of the fact that writing what you're really passionate about, and even beyond writing, just any career that you have, doing the work that you're really passionate about and leading with that is always going to give you the best success and the best longevity in the long run. Don't chase the trends. Don't just write what you think other people want to read, but write what you really want to say. And I think long term, that's what will give you the best career.
Mm, such good advice. I love it. Write what you really want to say. I think that is such good advice that anyone can take away from this is do what lights your soul on fire, do what inspires you, do the thing that you feel called to do above everything else. So
yeah.
I'm so proud of you, girl. I love you.
You.
Thank you for coming on and
for
sharing all of this. This is awesome.
Yes, thank you. This was fun.